Good morning. I'm going to lecture today on what's called wisdom literature. And what I mean by that is a form of literature that conveys important knowledge through stories. Now, you've already become acquainted with this kind of literature by reading Homer's Odyssey and some of the book of Genesis from the Hebrew Bible. And what I hope to do today is give you a larger context to see how these works of literature are tokens of a certain type, how they belong to a use of literature that we find in many different cultural contexts, also outside of the so called West. So, this lecture is on wisdom literature in East and West. And I'm going to talk to you about an author who is read sometimes as a contemporary of Homer, namely Hesiod, also about Solon. These are two representatives of what has been called wisdom literature in the Western tradition. But I'm also going to talk to you about Lao Tzu, a foundational figure in Chinese literature who lived around the 6th to 5th century before Common Era. So, first of all, let me give you an outline of the lecture. We're going to be talking about big knowledge and big questions. Wisdom is a kind of very important knowledge, a kind of knowledge that the cultural tradition privileges by presenting it in certain classics. And that's one reason why we read the classics, because this is knowledge that has been considered very important. There's a big difference, though, between the way that big knowledge is treated in pre-modern civilizations and today, and I'm going to talk about that first. Then I'm just going to give you some genre markers for wisdom literature so that you know how you can understand a given piece of literature as a type or token of wisdom literature. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Hesiod, and in particular about the reading from Works and Days that you read. And I'm going to compare that a bit with a famous elegy by Solon, the Athenian politician and poet. Then I'm going to move over to Lao Tzu and give you a bit of context for reading the Tao Te Ching. And that will be the end of the lecture. Now, first of all, here's a big item, namely a spiral galaxy, which isn't so far from our own Milky Way. And here's a big question. Does the universe have a moral order? Now, you might think that this question is a little strange. The fact that objects fall at a certain velocity is probably for us today has nothing to do with anything moral. But you'll notice that in many of the stories that we've been reading, the way the world is ordered is actually the result of some sort of intentional action on the part of a god or of gods. So in Atrahasis, a flood comes because gods are annoyed with human beings, but in Genesis, a flood comes because God wants to punish human beings. So in this way, pre-modern literature often integrates two stories that nowadays are quite different, namely one story about how the world is and another story about how we should act. But in pre-modern classics, for example, the Popol Vuh of the Mayans, and in many other traditional classics, these two questions are intertwined, and you can even find very keen scientific observation together with a moral story. Nowadays, if you went, say, to the physics department and asked a cosmologist about how you should live and what is the just way of living, they probably wouldn't say that they're professionally responsible for that. We've separated out these big questions. And of course, it's rather contentious who is responsible for the moral questions, Some people would say it's the ethicist. Another person might say it's the theologian. That's just the way things have changed from then to today. Now, justice within a moral universe is, as it were, the frame that keeps everything frame of reference which keeps everything together. It's not only a social frame, but it's also a natural or divine frame. And in order to tell a story about how the world is and should be, you also have to tell a story about how the social order as it is relates to the moral structure of the world. This is another trait of pre-modern literature, and in particular wisdom literature. Such literature can take a narrative form, such as the story of a conflict like the Iliad, or the story of God's relationship to a people in the 5 books of Moses, otherwise known as the Pentateuch. And it can take a non-narrative form, as we'll see. Solon basically prays publicly for certain goods, and in so praying shows us how we should think about those goods. So that's not telling a story, that's basically indirectly giving us some advice. Now, here are some characteristics of wisdom literature. It's traditional, it can be anonymous, and it can be attributed to an authority figure. Now, it's literature because it's been written down, but usually it comes from an oral tradition. And for technical and actually material reasons, the transmission of wisdom literature before the age of the printed book is always a tricky and precarious thing. Religious, it concerns gods and their relationship to humans, but we might want to keep this one trait in mind when we get to the Tao Te Ching, because it's not so clear if whether the Tao Te Ching is religious in this sense. Certainly the Western wisdom literature that we're looking at will be. Now, wisdom literature is also moral and practical. It tells you how to live, but it also gives you practical advice on how to do certain things and how to make a living. And it's foundational. It's used to explain everything else. It tends to be in structured verse, that is, in poetry. So let's just take a look and see where this kind of literature comes from. Now, in fact, we know from scholarship from like the last 50 years that the wisdom literature of Greece is to be located in a much bigger context. So, we're teaching a course here on the development of Western civilization, but as it turns out, Western civilization owes a lot to both Asia, that's this region around Assyria and Akkad, what is today Iraq, and also to northern Africa, namely to Egypt. These civilizations had very old writing systems and very old literary traditions. Also, the Hebrew Bible, it has many rays of influence which radiate out throughout the Mediterranean and probably also influence something like Hesiod. One recent scholar who's done a lot of work on this, he's now deceased, but he was a major innovator in the study of the Western reception of Eastern literature, was Martin West. And he writes in his book, The East Face of Helicon. Helicon is the mountain where Hesiod lived. So this is about the eastern side or eastern influence of what Hesiod did as a poet. He wrote, "Culture, like all forms of gas, tends to spread out from where it is densest into adjacent areas where it is less dense. For some 6,000 years from the 7th millennium BC to the 1st, a steady succession of arts, crafts, and comforts found their way from southwestern Asia, the cradle of the Neolithic Revolution, to southeastern Europe, and to that gnarled outpost of Europe, which we call Greece." Now that's a big thesis, and I can't back that up here, and frankly also Martin West doesn't really back it up in the book entitled The East Face of Helicon. But what he does show in that book, which is a very interesting book, is how there are Asiatic elements in Greek poetry and myth, as the title says, And a big part of his argument is actually about the poet Hesiod. And as this quote shows you, literature is just one part of the cultural influence that comes from the East. There are many other parts which archaeologists can document, and that is the transfer of certain forms of knowledge in the production of pottery, but also certain kinds of spatial organization in towns and in buildings. There's a large list of things that Greece very apparently has inherited from other Eastern cultures. Now, there are two kinds of wisdom literature, basically, in the Greek tradition. I mentioned them earlier, and now we can define them a little bit more accurately. One is precept literature, which is basically understood as a kind of moral and practical instruction for a particular person, delivered by a god or sage. Hesiod's Works and Days is a good example of this kind of literature because he's basically preaching to his brother, with whom he has a kind of inheritance battle. Another kind is the hymn or prayer version of wisdom literature. These are compositions in praise of or addressed to a god or king. And of course, you don't say just anything when you address God or a king. You say important things, things that are important to know, and that's why this kind of address is particularly suited to giving other people advice. Let's start with Hesiod, who comes from Helicon. There's the mountain of Helicon. You see that it's about, couple hundred kilometers west of Athens. And we don't know very much about Hesiod. Some people say he was a contemporary of Homer. Some people even say he was in a competition with Homer. That's hard for us to know. What we do know is that he composed two works. One is called Works and Days, and the other is the so-called Theogony. There are other works which probably have been lost. And unlike Homer, he's not telling us a big epic story or cycle. He tells us many stories which are wrapped up in a kind of narrative form of discourse. In this case, in the case of the Works and Days, a kind of harangue of another person. I'm just going to go over the beginning of Works and Days. The work itself is much longer, but for our purposes and for the purposes of what we'll read, we can divide it into the following parts. There's first a proem, where you address Zeus. There's a hymn to Zeus. Then he distinguishes two types of strife. He tells a myth of Prometheus, which is probably highly influenced by Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern sources, and also a story about the races of men, which probably in its original version only had 4 races of men, but then in his version comes to take on 5 because he had to include the Homeric and heroic race. And then he goes on to talk about justice and injustice, work, and dealing with men and gods. The work begins this way. Muses from Pieria, glorifying in songs, come here, tell in hymns of your father Zeus, through whom mortal men are famed and unfamed alike, and named and unnamed, by the will of great Zeus. Give ear to me, watching and listening, and straighten the verdicts with justice yourself. As for me, I will proclaim truths to Perses. Now, Perses is his brother with whom we learn later he's actually in a sort of estate battle. But let's just focus for now on the way the poem begins. So it begins with both an address of Zeus and the address of a person. We have a piece of exhortation directed at another person, not a story about some other person. Now we learn in lines 27 following that Hesiod and Perseus were engaged in a kind of inheritance dispute, and Hesiod says there to Perseus, "You will not have a second time to act this way, namely to engage in legal battles for the sake of another man's wealth." Hesiod advises his brother to rather keep to the good type of strife, the one which makes people envious and ambitious. We find a similar sort of thing in the Hebrew Bible, otherwise known as the Old Testament, where the psalmist addresses God and says, "O God, give your judgments to the king and your righteousness to the king's son. Let him judge the people with righteousness and your poor with justice." So a similar kind of invocation of God to be just and enforce justice. Our author is engaged in a concrete rhetorical situation which is a little bit more complicated. He's addressing two audiences at the same time. One, a divine audience, and the other, his nasty brother, who's taken too much of the inheritance. He's admonishing his brother in addressing the gods. And he uses this rhetorical basis to tell all kinds of stories which evidently belong to a collection of orally transmitted lore from his own cultural time and place. One of these stories we'll get to in just a minute. It's the story of Pandora's jar, and actually Pandora herself, who seems to be in herself a kind of vessel of bad things sent by the gods to hurt human beings. Now, as I said, Hesiod is telling some stories from his cultural time and place. The place is certainly Mount Helicon, a mountain about 6,000 feet high in what's called Boeotia, but the cultural horizon of the stories Hesiod has to tell is much larger. As Martin West's research has shown, Hesiod's poems have affinities to the wisdom literature in the Near East, and in this literature, precepts were directed either to a close relative like a son, or to a brother, or to a father figure like a king. In another standard type of wisdom literature, it's addressed to a group of kings, and Hesiod actually does both. There's a striking similarity between Hesiod's Works and Days and a parallel Egyptian and Sumerian text, or parallel Egyptian and Sumerian texts. He's talking to a kind of reprobate, a person who is negligent and in need of moral improvement, and this we also find, for example, in the psalmist's literature as well. There's another parallel to the Hebrew Bible in the story of Pandora, which is the story of the first woman to be created, this time as a punishment for the fire that Prometheus stole. The parallel between the theft of fire and the eating of fruit from the Garden of Eden consists in knowledge. The serpent in the garden said that eating the fruit would confer knowledge of good and evil. The woman, in the Greek version, brings evil to the Greeks as a kind of trick. The woman in the Garden of Eden brings evil upon herself through eating the apple. Pandora is a kind of Eve without an Adam. She brings a container full of evils, and she herself seems also to embody them. It is possible that Hesiod's story has an earlier Hebrew source, or that both of the stories are related to other ones which were current in ancient Near East and in Egypt. So here's one part from the beginning of Works and Days. He writes, "For previously the tribes of men used to live upon the earth entirely apart from evils and without grievous toil and distressful diseases, which give death to men. But a woman removed a great lid from the storage jar with her hands and scattered all its contents abroad. She wrought baneful evils for human beings." Now, as Martin West writes in his book, this could also refer to certain ancient Near Eastern magic rituals where evil things were collected up in a jar and then a lid was put on the jar, a kind of apotropaic or actually exorcism ritual where you take away the evil things by putting them in a container. That would make sense of this story that the woman comes and opens a jar and all sorts of evil things come out, as if the evil things had been contained in this actual physical container. There's another story in Hesiod's Works of Days, which seems also to have an ancient Near Eastern source, but it's a little bit more complicated. It's the tracking of history through certain kinds of metals. As you remember from your reading, there are four basic metallic ages: the gold, silver, bronze, and then the iron one. But he inserts into this fourfold model, which we find in many, many cultures, also in India, a fifth element, which is typically Greek, namely the heroic age. But there's something really strange about this story in a Greek context, namely, the Greeks tend to always idealize what comes before and not think that it is bad. Usually the present is bad, and over and against the past, the present is bad, but the past, whether distant or closer, is usually thought of as quite good. Whereas this model gives us a story of continuous decline. And of course, at the beginning of the story, we have a kind of utopia, just as in the Garden of Eden. We have a time and place where there are no evils for human beings, and then things just get worse and worse, and the quality of the people gets worse and worse, until we finally arrive at the race of iron. And there he writes, "Their hands will be their justice, and one man will destroy the other's city. Nor will there be any grace for the man who keeps his oath, nor for the just man or the good one, but they will give more honor to the doer of evil and the outraged man. Justice will be in their hands, and reverence will not exist, but the bad man will harm the superior one, speaking with crooked discourses, and he will swear an oath upon them." Now, this is a model of how civilization becomes when the justice that rules the universe is no longer kept in place by the divine order, but justice is in the hands of the human beings. As he writes, justice will be in their hands. So it's a transferal of the moral structure of the universe from the gods, who are responsible for the big picture and who keep big things like galaxies and small things like civilizations in line, down to people who make a mess of things. When justice is in their hands, justice is no longer done, because justice cannot be enforced, as it were, as a kind of structure of the universe. Human beings can just do what they do. But when they do what they do, they damage the big structure that carries them, as it were. And we can also see why it made sense in the tradition of wisdom literature to attribute major natural catastrophes to human actions. The idea was that by acting in such a way that went against the natural order, which at the same time was the order of justice, the natural order could strike back. And if you read about climate change, sometimes you'll find certain theological elements in the description of natural disasters today too. Now I want to move on to Solon, who, as you see here, is a celebrated figure even in the modern political tradition, and there's a reason for that. Solon is credited with the really quite significant ending of serfdom in Attica, which effectively ended the enslavement of at least the poor people of Attica at the hands of the rich. Of course, it was still possible for foreigners, that is, Greeks from outside of Attica and non-Greeks from throughout the Mediterranean, to be enslaved, but he was a major innovator in that he, at least on the account of our sources, effectively ended the enslavement of the poor people at the hands of the rich. He also greatly incentivized commerce through reforms in weights, measures, and coinage, and reformed the Athenian constitution in such a way which enfranchised non-aristocratic Athenians. So you could even participate in the governing of the state if you weren't from an aristocratic family. That was quite an innovation. He's deemed as an ideal statesman also in the American context, probably because of these two reasons: commerce and ending slavery. Maybe also for the constitutional enfranchisement, but the founders and framers of the US Constitution actually weren't so big on Athenian democracy. They actually thought Rome, with its aristocratic regime, was the better model. But still, at least we find homage paid to Solon in the US Library of Congress above, and in a little inlay in the House of the Representatives. So here's an example of wisdom literature in the hands of Solon. He writes, "Splendid children of memory and Olympian Zeus, give ear, Pierian muses, unto my prayer. Grant me prosperity at the hands of the blessed gods, and good fame ever at the hands of men. Make me, I pray you, sweet to my friends and sour to my foes. To these a man to look on with respect, to those one to look on with dread. Wealth I strive to have, but I refuse to possess it unjustly. In all ways, justice comes later. The wealth which the gods give comes to man as something steadfast from bottom to top, whereas the wealth which men value under the influence of hubris does not come in accordance with order, but unwillingly follows unjust works, and ruin is soon mixed in with it." This part of his elegy, which is a certain poetic form, which consists of elegiac couplets, so 2 verses at a time, in a certain meter. This elegy repeats a theme from Hesiod, namely that the real benefits have a divine source, even in practical matters, even in matters of wealth and property. He too addresses Pierian muses, but notice that the poems work more immediately, as statements of what the poet wishes for himself and thus recommends for others. The poet is taking on the role of a sage by praying in a formal poetic way for certain goods and carefully qualifying how you should pursue them. Now let's move on to something quite different. Namely, the story of Lao Tzu, who, if he really existed, was, according to much later sources, from the province of Zhou in ancient China in around the 6th to the 5th century before Common Era. Now, he is known as the founder of Taoism, and Taoism became both a philosophy and an organized religion, and the people who believed in the philosophy weren't necessarily the people who were part of the organized religion, but the two groups did intersect. It's a little complicated. I'm going to work with the modern transliteration of his name, by the way, which is Laozi with a Z. Now, Laozi's book was originally just called Laozi because you named a book after its author. Usually people were authors of just one book. But it got the name Tao Te Ching much later when it became an official classic. That's what a Qing means. And at that time, it was given the title of Wei Virtue Classic, which is the literal translation of Tao Te Ching. So in the title of the book, it says it's a classic. That's the simple version. The somewhat more complicated version goes like this. Tao, or Tao, can mean many different things. It can mean way. It can also mean path, route, road, or doctrine, principle. So it's a very pregnant concept. So is Te, or De. Can mean virtue, but it can also mean inner power, inherent character, or morality. All of these concepts that we use to translate them are probably related in a certain way for us, but in a different way through this concept of Te and De. And of course, that's always the difficult part in translating concepts from other cultures and contexts. And Qing, that's probably the most straightforward of the words in the title. that definitely means classic or canon or great book. Now, it's probable that the Tao Te Ching was revised at some point to have a certain number of characters, 5,000 characters. It consists in 81 chapters, and there's usually a division between these chapters that corresponds to two parts: the Tao Ching, so the classic about the way, and the Te Ching, the classic about virtue. Certain documents which were found much later in history suggest that there might have been a different ordering of the chapters at some point. So it could have been the Te Tao Ching, where the virtue part came first and the way part came second. And that's a matter for scholarly debate. We're just working with the edition we have, and we'll try to make the best sense we can out of that. Now, it becomes a sacred text for Taoism, and in so doing, it also becomes the basis for a bunch of different traditions. Traditional Chinese medicine, martial arts, but also astrology and divination. Maybe some of you know of the book called the I Ching that is also based on the concepts developed in the Tao Te Ching, and not least Chinese Buddhism, which would go on to influence Japanese culture. One of the central concepts, and one which is actually quite paradoxical if you think of this as a piece of wisdom literature, is Wu Wei, which means non-action. So remember Hesiod and Solon telling their addressees to do this and do that. Well, now we come to the Tao Te Ching with Lao Tzu telling us to not do. A very different kind of wisdom literature, but I think you can argue that it's wisdom literature nonetheless. Let's begin with the very first chapter. There we read, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things." Now, in the very poetic translation of Stephen Mitchell, this sounds almost like something Yoda would say in Star Wars, and that's not an accident, actually. Certain cultural products like Star Wars are very much influenced by this kind of literature and this kind of thinking. But if you take a moment to think about what he's saying here, it's quite explosive and actually quite subversive. And it's understandable that in the history of the reception of the Tao Te Ching, this work was actually understood as having some revolutionary potential, because it is basically undermining the very idea of convention. When he writes, "Naming is the origin of all particular things," it seems that he's criticizing the idea or the ideas that get introduced through fixing things through language. That is definitely suggested by the first two lines of this poem, where he says, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao." So in articulating something, even talking about it, we're falsifying it. The idea is in even naming something as something, we've already missed it. We've already failed to achieve understanding of it. That's actually a pretty radical claim. It goes on. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. This is maybe reminiscent for some of you of kind of riddle language, but it's not necessarily just riddling for riddling's sake. The idea behind this passage seems to be fairly clear. That is, value words create other value words that are polar opposites to the value words that you create. So the idea here seems to me to be that if you assign a value to something, say the value beautiful, you will also imply, at least, another kind of value, the value ugly. And when you apply something as a value, um, namely good, you are at the same time creating another value, namely bad. And as soon as you create a value in one direction, you also, in consequence, will have created some values in the other direction. And this seems to want to criticize the idea that these things are somehow totally different. He's putting them into a bigger context, as it were, and showing you how they are related. Even opposites are related, and in fact, are the condition for each other. Then he comes to speaking of the Tao. And remember, that's the thing that you can't really talk about. But he's taking a kind of apophatic position on the Tao. That means he tells us all the things that it is not. So in this passage, he tells us the Tao doesn't take sides. It gives birth to both good and evil. The master doesn't take sides. She welcomes both the virtuous and the bad. The Tao is like a bellows. It is empty, yet infinitely capable. The more you use it, the more it produces. The more you talk of it, the less you understand. Hold on to the center. Well, that's pretty strange. If we're not allowed to talk about the Tao, because otherwise we would run the risk of misunderstanding it, then, well, what is he doing? What is he up to? How are we to understand his text? Because he says that basically, at least in the first part of the book, it's all about the Tao. So this is a very paradoxical kind of situation, one in which the master is telling us to stop talking about the thing that we're supposed to think about. But maybe that's just the point. Certainly in later Zen Buddhistic traditions, the idea of absence and the idea of not talking is very important for focusing on the thing that is real. And of course, in that tradition as well, the idea that what is only the product of our language, our conventions, and our conceptions, our thinking, our habits, is the unreal thing. And the really real thing is the thing that we cannot grasp with those cultural means. Now, you could reasonably ask at this point, is this wisdom literature? I didn't see any mention of gods or previous sages, and this is anti-precept literature. It tells us not to act. It was written in a very different place, and there's probably no likely influence connection between Lao Tzu and, say, Hesiod, certainly because Hesiod probably lived before Lao Tzu. And it's not really tradition-based literature. It's kind of revolutionary. For example, it introduces a totally new concept, the Tao or Way. And that concept was considered radical, certainly by people in Lao Tzu's time and afterwards. Until, of course, it became a classic and was, as it were, tamed by the canon by becoming a classic piece of literature. Well, I think nevertheless you can make the case for this being a kind of wisdom literature, because certainly it is a way to encode special knowledge in verse and to exhort the person to whom you're talking. But I want you to actually just try it out for yourself. The assignment that I have for you is to write 10 to 15 lines in the style of the Tao Te Ching. Try to adapt the style of writing that Stephen Mitchell has in rendering the Tao Te Ching. Focus on an idea, just one, from the Tao Te Ching and try to develop it further. That's the poetic part of your assignment. Then there's a prosaic part. In a commentary on your own text, briefly explain what part of the Tao Te Ching you took as your inspiration and how your chapter develops an idea from that work. So that was my lecture for today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to reading your new chapters of the Tao Te Ching.